Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Saladino. This podcast is the result of my relentless search to understand and correct the roots of chronic disease and illness. In this podcast, I will share with you everything I have learned about how to live the most healthy and radical life possible. Thanks for joining me on this journey. What's going on, you guys? You should know that this week is a big one for me. I finished residency. I'm done with residency, and I'm on my way to San Diego as you are listening to this podcast. If you're listening to it the week of June, I guess the 16th, that is. Anyway, it's a big week for me. And also this week, the podcast that I did with the Minimalists and Rich Roll and my good friend Tommy Wood got released. If you guys listened to last week's episode of the podcast, you heard Tommy and me rapping about all sorts of cool things. That dude is a smart cookie. One of the things we talked about was our podcast with the Minimalists and Rich Roll. And if you guys have not checked out that podcast with Rich Roll and the Minimalists and me and Tommy, you should listen to that too. One of the things that came up repeatedly on that podcast, and I'll just say this, I told this to Rich directly during the podcast, was that his conception of the environmental impact of ruminant animals on greenhouse gases, emissions, many things was frankly incorrect by all of my understanding through talking to numerous scientists about environmental issues regarding the consumption and raising of ruminant livestock. I think the environmental issues around carnivore diets, around eating meat in general, are often talked about and rarely talked about with as much clarity as this conversation or as much clarity as the gentleman on today's podcast, Peter Ballerstedt, is able to bring to the discussion. So I am so grateful to have Peter on the podcast today with me. Before the conversation with Rich Roll, I reviewed much of his material, and he and I had a long private conversation in which he sort of educated me on many of these issues in great detail, and much of that information I was able to bring to the table to, let's just say, disabuse Rich Roll of the often repeated and clearly inaccurate notions that many in the plant-based sphere will suggest regarding the environmental impact of ruminant animals. So Peter is an awesome guy, and I am very appreciative for all of that information that he shared with me prior to this conversation with Rich Roll. In this conversation, you will learn even more, and you will be impressed at his appreciation for this knowledge base. So he earned his bachelor's and master's degrees at the University of Georgia. He has a doctorate from the University of Kentucky. He was the forage extension specialist at Oregon State University from 1986 to 1992, and he currently works in the forage seed industry. So he is involved in the sort of cattle and forage industry. His personal experience has led him to re-examine human diet and health. What he has learned doesn't agree with the advice given for the past several decades. No surprise there. Much of what I have learned and discovered does not agree with the advice given for the past several decades either. His new understanding combined with his forage background has given him an increased passion for the key to true social, economic, and ecological sustainability, which he and I both agree are ruminant animal production systems, and these are the source of butter, red meat, and cheese. He has spoken at many different events. Perhaps some of you have been fortunate enough to meet him or hear him at some of these. His presentations are available on YouTube if you Google or look up Peter Ballerstedt, Ballerstedt. Perhaps we should just call him Peter Ballerstedt because he's baller. His blog is Grass-Based Health. He is on Facebook as well, and he posts to Twitter and Instagram at Grass-Based. He and his wife Nancy live in Western Oregon with their two dogs, Connor and Noni, and he is affectionately known as the Sod Father and has a group of people that he considers to be friends who he would term the Ruminati. So he has a good sense of humor. He's a great guy, and I really enjoyed sort of continuing to have this discussion. I think many of you guys will enjoy deepening your environmental knowledge regarding ruminant agriculture and how this affects us on the planet. It's my clear belief that ruminants are good for the planet. They're an integral source of phosphorus for the soil. They've been a part of our ecosystem on the face of the earth for millions of years, and they are an integral and contributing part. And if managed properly, as Peter suggests, and as we are seeing with farms like White Oak Pastures and the work of Alan Savory, can actually create carbon negative processes in these farms. They can actually create increased amounts of soil-based organisms, soil-based organic matter, which can be a sink for carbon, decreasing the total amount of carbon in the atmosphere, which is a pretty amazing thing. So it's really cool stuff. All right, you guys. So as always, this podcast is brought to you by the incredible Ancestral Supplements. You guys know that I am a fan of these guys, that I am a fan of eating organs, that I am a fan of eating nose to tail. I think this is a really, really big deal. And I talk about it every week because it's a really big deal and I like it a lot. And they are a really cool group of people who source New Zealand bone marrow, nose to tail organ meats like liver, heart, kidney, pancreas, brain, and more. And they put it in a simple, convenient gelatin capsule so it's so easy to take if you don't like the taste of liver or the other things. I have been trying to get my hands, my dirty little hands, on some brain for so long, and someone actually reached out to me on Instagram and said they'd send me some. So I'm so excited to get some. I don't have it yet. Once I get to San Diego, I'm going to eat that. But you can get grass-fed beef brain by Ancestral Supplements too. I think that this is a really intriguing concept, and there are many neurotrophic factors in the brain that could potentially support the survival of existing neurons and encourage the growth of new neurons, as well as sphingomyelin, which we know plays a role in the myelin sheath, the little wrappers on the neuronal dendrites and axons that potentiate cell signaling. So I definitely take their beef brain supplement when I don't have real brain, which is pretty rare, and I'm really curious what it could be doing for all of you. I think it probably is beneficial for all of us humans to be eating more nose to tail and getting this brain in. I think that if we think evolutionarily speaking, the brain was probably one of the most important things that we were eating as humans. We probably had access to the brain in a way that very few other animals did, and the nutrients in that brain, like DHA, were uniquely beneficial for humans. So pretty great stuff. So check out ancestralsupplements.com. They are putting back in what the modern world has left out. Okay, do you guys get my newsletter? Because you should. I do a lot of work on this. Every week, I put in an article that I like. I talk about what's going on with me. I talk about who's on the podcast, which you're listening to. I talk about cool stuff I like. It won't always be products. Maybe it'll be books. Maybe it'll be other things. But I talk about cool stuff I like, and I talk about what's coming up for me. So check out my newsletter. If you're not subscribed, paulsaladinomd.com/newsletter. Check it out. I put it out about every week, and I think it will be worth your time. Let me know what you think of it. I am also continuing to be super stoked about my Juve light. This is my near-infrared light that I put all over my body day and night. I do it in the morning and I do it at night, and I recently retested my testosterone, and my total testosterone went up about 150 units. I think it's, I'd have to check the actual units, but it went up from about 570 to 700. And the main thing that I changed was a little bit of Juve light. So I think that there are many research studies which suggest this could be beneficial in all sorts of ways. And it feels good, and it mimics sort of our circadian exposure to near infrared and red light in the morning and at night. So check them out. www.joov.com/Paul. Check it out. All right, you guys, we are going to roll. We are going to rock into this podcast. The only thing I would suggest before we do that is, please, if you like this podcast, leave me a review. Support me. I love all of you guys who have left me reviews. This podcast is going great, you guys. It's been super successful. I love doing this. This is probably the favorite thing that I do every week. If you like it, please leave me a review on iTunes. Tell your friends about it. That helps me reach more people. That's the key. That is the iTunes currency. So leave me a review there. If you don't like it, feel free to leave a review as well and let me know what I can do better, or just email me directly because I don't see all the reviews. The email is paulsaladinomd@gmail.com. And as many of you will know, I am moving to San Diego this week. I'm done with residency. I'm moving to San Diego, and I am going to be opening a private practice there. If you are interested in being seen in person, let me know, paulsaladinomd@gmail.com. I also do virtual consults with people all over the world. So if you want to work with me, functional medicine, etc., you want to tune up, you want to optimize, you want to try and work on some of those issues, paulsaladinomd@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. All right, you guys, I like to talk, but let's talk with Peter Ballerstedt. You're going to like this one. Enjoy learning about how cow farts are not destroying the environment and how beneficial these beautiful animals can be for our health and long-term longevity as humans on this planet. All right, you guys, check it out. Oh, before we go to the show, I forgot. I have to add this in. My affiliate code for Ancestral Supplements is SALADINOMD, SALADINOMD. That'll get you 10% off. Do it. If you're going to get stuff from them, let them know that I sent you. Support the show, support the podcast, support them. They do good stuff. All right, on to the show. All right, blast off. Here I am with Peter Ballerstedt. Peter, thank you for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to be hanging out with you on this sunny afternoon.
It's my pleasure to join you, Paul. And yeah, it's a beautiful day here in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, I'm soon moving to San Diego, as many will know, but it's nice to... It's going to be great. Don't you worry.
Yeah, of course it is.
I'm going to be surfing so much. It's going to be fantastic. But, you know, people may not know this, but you were a huge help to me prior to a recent debate and discussion that I had with Rich Roll. So I want to thank you for that. And I think that so many of the things that we talked about prior to that conversation with Rich on the Minimalists podcast, which will probably be coming out about the same time this podcast is released, will be things that I think our audience will want to hear about. So why don't we just dive right in? I mean, I think that in the carnivore space, in the health space in general right now, there is this interesting resurgence of people realizing that animal foods are incredibly nutritious. And as many listening to the podcast will know, I am a huge advocate for a carnivore diet, but I think I have lots of listeners who are not doing full carnivore, and that's awesome. And so I think this conversation is relevant to everyone in the space who eats animal foods and hears or has concerns about the way those animal foods may impact the environment. So why don't you give us your perspective, maybe an overall background perspective on that, and then we can drill down into some of these points that you've discussed so eloquently in the past.
Well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to have you in the Ruminati herd. So the Sodfather is pleased to help. And I come into this from my own personal experience. And then, of course, I have my professional background. And I just want to help people feel comfortable about adopting a lifestyle that suits them and is improving their health. And so clearly we're getting all these messages about how your food choices have this dramatic impact on the environment. And a lot of that is really just continuing the narrative. And that narrative is that it's plant-based is the best for your health and it's best for the planetary health. And I think that we can clearly show that that's wrong on both those points. There's certain basic things that we just have to accept and we have to then move on. Number one is humans technically are heterotrophic organisms. We must consume other organisms. They can be plants, they can be animals, and animals could be fish or fowl or mammals. Human beings have eaten anything that hasn't eaten them first. So we have a wide range in what we can use to support ourselves. But then we have to acknowledge that animal source foods are superior sources of nutrition in the human diet. And again, for some that's controversial, but from a scientific perspective, it really isn't or shouldn't be. As a ruminant agriculturalist, I can explain how ruminant animal agriculture offers unique ecological advantages over other forms of all food production, let alone animal source food production. Frankly, there is no such thing as sustainable agriculture without ruminant animals as a part of it in some way. We need to understand that ruminant animals are not competing with humans for resources. And these are shortened sort of summaries of statements that we can dig into more. But that, in fact, ruminant animals increase the quantity and quality of our food supply worldwide. And they do that in a number of specific ways we could get into. If you look at the history of humanity, first of all, ruminant animals were around for a lot longer than we've had modern humans, by a long shot. And that modern humans arguably exist because there were ruminant animals that they could exploit as a food source. Modern societies are completely dependent on ruminant animal agriculture around the world, and that they will be essential for the future of humanity, despite what people propose as alternatives. And then the bit that you mentioned that we can drill into more is, frankly, the estimates of ruminant animal agriculture's environmental impact are typically, to be charitable, overstated, oversimplified, and at best misleading. And so taking that all as a brief introduction, I then want to encourage people that if you are finding that as a result of eating more animal products, and that's a sliding scale for each of us, some of us go much more toward carnivore, some go completely carnivore, that's okay. And don't listen to the voices that sold you the diet that made you sick in the first place. Don't let them make you feel guilty.
Oh man, I love it. I love it, Peter. Thank you. You made so many good points there. I'll just highlight a few of them and then we can drill down into that. I think that the carnivore movement is so interesting because the first point you made is really very difficult to debate scientifically from a nutritional biochemical standpoint. And that is the fact that animals provide clearly superior nutrition for humans than plant foods. I think that when people begin to realize that, or they dig into that science and they accept that and they become woke to the fact that animals are so nutritional that everything else begins to fall into place, or at least the reason that we're having these discussions is made totally apparent. Because when people realize that animals are this incredible source of human nutrition and that the nutrients in animals are so much more bioavailable than plants, and then as I've talked about on other podcasts, that by avoiding plants or limiting plants, we get so many less of the plant toxins, that it's just the whole discussion becomes so important. It's this idea that, wait a minute, these are the most nutritious foods on the planet. Of course I should be eating them. And then you made another point, which was amazing, and that's the evolutionary idea. I did a previous podcast with Miki Ben-Dor that's on my YouTube channel, and I'll probably post it to iTunes soon. And we talked about these concepts that humans eating ruminants and large animals really made us human. And I say human with quotations and air quotes, this transition from Australopithecus to Homo erectus, Homo habilis. So these 2 points are so important. Animals are clearly the ultimate multivitamin, eating them nose to tail, in my opinion. And we have been eating them throughout our evolution, and there are strong anthropologic arguments that it was our consumption of these animals that allowed our brains to grow, that allowed us to become who we are. And so then the discussion becomes so important around how they're raised and how they play a role in ecosystems. And as you mentioned, undoing or really clarifying the ways that these arguments against eating animals have gone horribly wrong and are very misleading. So I love it. Let's dig into it. Do you want to start with the ideas around greenhouse gases?
Well, sure. That's a great place to start because it's one that's quite current, and it's a tricky thing to deal with. But let's just look at the claims where you hear, you should pardon the expression, these inflated claims for what the greenhouse gas emissions are, and from one of the things that we need to pay attention to is it matters very much whether you're talking about figures from beef production, for example, in the United States, or you're talking about beef production in a place like Brazil. The United States is far more efficient. Their level of emissions per pound of edible product are a fraction of what they are in other parts of the world. And that's one of our challenges going forward, is to help other parts of the world become more efficient, to lower their environmental impact. If you hear anyone say, for example, that over half of our anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are coming from cattle, that's just a very dated, very misleading, quite refuted figure. If you hear someone say that more than transportation, that's another figure that has been retracted and recalculated. In the United States today, the estimate for all of agriculture in the United States today is about 9% of our anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are coming from agriculture. And if you look at just livestock agriculture, you're looking at approximately 4%. So what that means to me is 9 minus 4 leaves 5. That's the plant agriculture is 5% of the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And transportation and power generation, electricity, are something like 28% each, just for a sense of scale. Now, it's not fair.
Such a different...
Yes, yes, it is. Welcome to the weird world that I get to walk through. And again, I understand people hear what they hear and then they carry that forward. We just need to, just as people who have come to question the narrative of what constitutes a healthy diet, these other topics are not unrelated, and so we should be aware that there are agendas and narratives and worldviews at play there too. And then as we become more aware of that, we also find that, oh, look, it's some of the same people involved. That's remarkable. So if you look worldwide, the figure for animal agriculture worldwide percent of greenhouse gas emissions is something like, I think it's like 14, 15, 16% total. And one of the reasons it's bigger is because in other parts of the world, one, they're not as efficient. Two, they also don't have industry or transportation or power generation to the degree that we do. So that's why it becomes a bigger figure worldwide.
Interesting.
So that's a little different than what we've been told. Also, I've been told, now I have the paper, people who study in this area tell me it's not a fair comparison. I just can't help myself. I still have to use it. U.S. greenhouse gas emissions from the healthcare industry are 10%. Now, the reason I'm told that you shouldn't use that one, Pete, is because it's probably because in that study they were looking for how much power, how much food, et cetera, went into healthcare. So they're kind of double counting there. But it does make the point that the healthcare industry itself has a greenhouse gas or environmental footprint. Unfortunately, the standard narrative applies there too, so that when the healthcare industry talks about sustainability, they automatically assume that we need to be promoting a plant-based diet.
It's just crazy. It's just crazy. So where did
there was a
so where
yeah
yeah, go ahead.
there was a study performed where they tried to model what would happen if we completely removed animal agriculture from the United States. And they came up with, everything's a cost and benefit here. So, and it should be pointed out as well that when you eliminate animal agriculture, you're also eliminating the animals, right? They don't stay around. So after the world's largest barbecue, what are we left with? Well, the possible benefit is a 2.6% reduction in anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. If you expand that worldwide, you're a little short of 0.4% global. Now, what's the possible cost? The possible cost is that we unbalance our food ecosystem and we create essential dietary nutrient deficiencies. So, doesn't sound like a good deal to me.
Doesn't sound like a good deal to me either. It sounds like a horrible deal. And it's so interesting to see that. And maybe we can just explain for people why and how the figures will differ between estimates, because there was some recalculation of the figures from the FAO, correct? There was this idea, there's this movie Cowspiracy, and there are all of these sort of, I guess I will venture and just say vegan propaganda movies that tend to misquote a series of statistics that were from a data set that was subsequently recalculated. It was withdrawn and there were errors, and then it was recalculated, right? So I just want to explain to people why they may have heard these figures and why there's such a difference in what they may have heard and the actual real facts.
Sure. The simple version is that in Livestock's Long Shadow, which was the FAO report, they compared the greenhouse gas emissions from livestock and certainly from cattle on a life cycle basis. So that means everything from birth to leaving the farm. They compared that to just the tailpipe emissions for transportation or energy generation. So, in other words, you're trying to figure out all of the emissions due to all of the inputs and all of the activities related to beef production, and you're comparing it to just the carbon dioxide emission equivalents from the fuel consumption in the car. You're not looking at the CO2 produced to make the concrete that made the roads. You're not looking at the emissions due to mining activities or smelting to produce the metal or building the car or the petroleum lubricants that are, you get the idea. So it was very much an apples to oranges comparison. And when that was pointed out, the authors admitted that that was correct. And so then an effort was made to recalculate. But unfortunately, in today's environment, once something is launched, it lives forever. I think Dr. Mike Eads refers to them as zombie myths. They just will never die. And they serve a narrative. What is somebody said? Worldviews are like glasses. They're not what you look at. They're what you look through at everything else. And so we have people today that are not as concerned about human health and flourishing and well-being as I am. and they then will accept or color their perception of information that would suggest that their recommended diet actually harms people, and they'll find a way to explain that in service of a greater good in their mind, which is environmental impact as they understand it. And unfortunately, I think they're misinformed badly on all of those cases.
Yeah, it really sounds like the emissions from cattle are a small percentage of what we're dealing with in the world and in the United States. And that, as you mentioned, if we were, at least in the study that you mentioned, if we were to eliminate all livestock, we would probably get complete ecological collapse in and of itself, but we would also only get a very small change in the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think that it's important for people to realize that in the carnivore movement, in the paleo movement, in the ketogenic movement, basically in a whole foods, animal-based movement, or any movement that seeks to encourage people to eat animal foods for their health, it's not that we're disregarding the environmental impact of these, but that we're carefully considering this. And we want the environment to be healthy for future generations as well. We want our kids to have non-global warmed, oceans, and we want there to be glaciers, and we want people to have an ecosystem that's sustainable for human life. But when we actually look at the science, gosh, it's pretty striking that these animal foods are not really as horrible as they're made out to be. And as you point out, Peter, it seems to suggest that there's just an agenda at play beneath the surface, and to me, it seems like nothing less than propaganda.
Well, and I was at a conference recently that was looking at the issue of sustainability in beef production. We had ranchers from around the world as part of this audience, and one gentleman was saying, I'm fourth generation rancher on this property, which is remarkable. Think about being on the same piece of property that your father, grandfather, and great-grandfather also walked on. And they're concerned about the same thing, right? They want to leave something for their children. They want to be a sixth generation. We had a gentleman from Southern Africa who said, yeah, I figure I'm about 25th generation. So this goes very deep, and the ranchers and farmers are concerned about exactly the same thing that customers and consumers are concerned about. And unfortunately, we live in a world where it tends to devolve to us versus them. And part of my mission is to get people from my nutrition tribes to listen, to speak with and to speak to the members of my agricultural tribes. Because we all need to learn from each other, right? We're all concerned about the same things. And so I really think that this idea, well, first of all, right? I mean, as I've said before, I love a good fart joke as much as the next guy. But the fact that this conversation devolves to cattle farts, when it's not the farts, it's the belches. Now, maybe that's just an indication of my mind that would seem important, but that's the degree of we can't even get that right. and the simple fact is that the poorer the quality, the less, which means less fiber digestion, right? The lower the fiber digestibility in the animal's ration, the more methane they will emit. That's just part of the nature of it. And so if we were to eliminate all of our domesticated livestock and, let's say replace them with bison, there'd still be methane emissions. They'd just be coming from the bison instead of from the cattle.
Right.
And they'd also be coming from the termites, and they'd also be coming from any number of other natural sources. But here's a key point about the cattle or the bison or the termites. Life is this cycling of CO2 being reduced in photosynthesis to form carbohydrate, which is then ingested by, in this case, we'll talk about cattle. The cattle themselves can't directly digest the fiber, but because they host this multitude of microorganisms, the microorganisms produce cellulase, which is necessary to break those bonds and release the glucose. Part of that releases methane to the atmosphere, but that methane breaks down in about 10 years. It's oxidized back to CO2. So it's a cycling of CO2, not an enrichment. Contrast that with burning fossil fuels, which represents an enrichment of CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, again, this is just one aspect of the conversation, but I think it's an important one for us to also consider. So the cattle actually are utilizing this vast resource that we can't directly utilize as a food source for humans. And we can do this in a way that enriches the environments in which this form of agriculture takes place. It's already being done. It's just we're not very good at talking about it. I'm looking for some figures right now. I think we start talking about ecosystem services. These are benefits to the environment that the rancher is not compensated for. So things like wildlife habitat, which includes the production of feed that wildlife eat. It would include things like wildfire suppression because we're not allowing the buildup of fuel, etc., those sorts of things. And one paper that I could send has this figured at about 37 cents a pound of beef. Mm-hmm. That's after we've accounted for the carbon cost. And again, it's not compensated. And that's before we've begun to deal with the 9.3% of GDP equivalent that's due to the cost of obesity-related diseases. So this is part of the conversation I'm trying to initiate and foster, which is to say, we haven't yet begun to have a sort of, pasture to plot as in funeral conversation about sustainability. And when we do that, then it shifts. And we could also point to human nutrition is several decades behind other monogastric nutrition disciplines like swine nutrition. Swine rations are balanced on amino acid basis. We are still talking about protein as a percent of calories in human nutrition. We're still talking about protein, not understanding that that's crude protein in human nutrition. And if we can get ourselves to start looking at essential amino acid supply from different food production systems, we find, and put that, then look at the emissions from those, make those comparisons, we find that animal agriculture falls right in line with the plant forms, and that's only looking at protein. There are lots of nutrients that we can only get from animal source foods. And so, again, if we could have a fuller examination of the value of animal source foods, it would dramatically shift the conversation.
Yeah, I think that, so many points there. So I love that you highlighted the fact that there is a carbon cycle and that methane is broken down into carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but that the emissions from technology and from transportation maybe are not in the same way. Is that correct? That there's some carbon-based molecules that persist in the environment as greenhouse gases, but that methane is not necessarily one of those. Methane participates in this carbon cycling. Is that correct, that the carbon produced from technology and transportation persists and sort of, as you've said, adds cumulatively to the environmental load?
Yes, the burning of fossil fuels, hydrocarbons, produces carbon dioxide that represents an enrichment of the atmosphere.
Right.
The enteric methane emissions from ruminant digestion represents a cycling of CO2 from the atmosphere through the plants, through the animal, back to the atmosphere. First as methane, but then that's oxidized back to CO2 in a short time frame. The CO2 then lasts as long as the CO2 from fossil fuel combustion, but of course, the one represents a cycling and the other represents an enrichment.
Yes, so the methane is part of a cycle. There's no extra CO2 being added to the atmosphere, but by burning fossil fuels, as you say, by burning hydrocarbons, we are adding to the total CO2 emissions. So we're really, again, comparing apples to oranges if we're looking at methane emissions versus burning of hydrocarbons. The other thing that you mentioned...
And
yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say the other thing you mentioned was the enrichment of the land that the cattle are on. So I wanted to highlight that again for people, because I know there are some farms like White Oak Pastures in Georgia and the farms that Alan Savory is involved in, you may know of more, that are actually showing that by pasturing animals on that land, they are enriching the quality of the soil, increasing the organic nature of the soil, and the soil can actually create a carbon sink, and they're carbon negative. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. It's a complicated field to work in. You should pardon the expression. And it's hard to do that kind of work. It takes years, and there's a number of people doing good work in that space, actual measurements. But one thing is clear, and that is anytime you cultivate the soil, you add oxygen, you increase the oxidation of organic matter. That's converting that soil carbon material back to carbon dioxide. By keeping perennial plant stands, which is what most pastures are based on, not exclusively, but most, you end up with growing plants with growing roots in the soil for a far longer period of time. You have much less cultivation. Also, perennial plants, one of the ways that they perenniate, live from year to year for long periods of time, is they put much more of their energy into root mass than annual crops do, like corn or wheat or the cereal crops or vegetables for that matter. So you tend to see these plants putting much more fixed carbohydrate, fixed CO2 into the soil due to their nature. And then when you graze a plant, you remove a certain amount of its leaf area. It doesn't need all the roots it had to have to support the plant initially. A rough rule of thumb is you kind of see about equal amounts of biomass in a perennial plant above and below ground. So you remove, half of that in any one grazing under a managed grazing system. And you can think that something like half of the root mass is no longer necessary, so the plant just kind of lets those roots slough or die or what have you. That's a pulse of that organic matter into the soil. Now, organic matter in soil is something that reaches an equilibrium based on a number of constraints. There was recently a paper published that looked at comparison of grass finishing and feedlot finishing systems in the upper Midwest. And they looked at emissions and soil carbon sequestration over, I think it was a 4-year period. And what they found was that, not surprisingly, under the feedlot finishing system, there were lower emissions than under the grazing finishing system. But that under the grazing finishing system, the carbon sequestration that took place in the soil more than offset what was emitted under the grazing finishing system. Now, there's a couple things to kind of look at there. One is, well, if you practiced your improved management throughout the lifetime of that animal, remember the finishing phase is 3 or 4 months at the end of a 2-year cycle, roughly. So if you were to practice that throughout the lifespan, then probably we're getting very close to the entire system being carbon neutral or carbon negative. Number 2 is that they were working on soils that had previously been in cropping systems, so their organic matter was somewhat depleted to begin with. And I mentioned earlier this equilibrium being established at some point. This is work that we really are only beginning to do, so there's a lot still to be done. But I count it all as good news. And again, very much different than what we've been told.
So those sorts of things are never highlighted.
I understand. And that's part of my mission and role, is to just try to get information available. There are some people, there's one quote, those convinced against their will are of the same opinion still. So you can't, force somebody to change their mind. But the other one is that if an honest man is shown to be in error, he either ceases to be in error or he ceases to be honest. And so we'll just put the information out there. As I said, we've got to get better at telling the story, which, I've now gotten to hear Gary Taubes twice talk about his upcoming book, where he's spoken to, I forget the number of clinicians, doctors around the world who are now recommending or utilizing restricted carbohydrate, ketogenic, carnivorous, it's all a spectrum to me, diets in their practices. And one of the constant things is that these physicians typically had their own personal experience, or it was the experience of one of their patients that just shifted their paradigm, just opened their eyes to something. So, and he talks about multiplying the personal experiences. How do we get more of those happening? Because that seems to be a critical part of people sort of change, all of a sudden going, whoa, wait a minute. So I'm very interested in what we can do to multiply those experiences. And I'm also, as I've already mentioned, trying to talk to people from across the production and distribution chain to, one, get them aware of the really good news about metabolic health and nutrition that's based in what I see as a more modern understanding of nutrition.
Yeah. There's so many things changing in our nutritional viewpoint. This might be a great time. I'd love to hear a little bit about your personal story with diet, but I just want to highlight the other thing that you said about the soil and how when we till the soil, when we disturb the soil, we are going to oxidize many of the organic compounds in the soil, and that releases carbon dioxide, and that actually degrades the quality of the soil. So it's this idea that we will probably need to till the soil at some point if we want to grow things in the soil, but that over-tilling of the soil and that agriculture, especially monocrop agriculture, which you probably know this number. I don't even know how much agriculture in the United States is monocropped, but I imagine it's mostly monocropped because whenever I'm driving through Central California, it's all one plant and all another plant. But that type of monocrop agriculture is eroding the topsoil and degrading the nutrients in the soil, right? I mean, this way of farming the land is oxidizing that topsoil and creating some pretty severe problems with the quality of that soil.
Well, so in January, I was in Bismarck, North Dakota. Yeah, I need to talk to my travel agent. But I was there with a group of people that are concerned about soil health and grazing management, and it was a fascinating opportunity for me to learn. Introduced me to a gentleman who's the soil fertility extension specialist, North Dakota State University. He has a presentation, you can find it on YouTube, The History of Phosphate Export from North Dakota. Yeah, I know, fascinating stuff. And he starts with the first European settlers who literally went out onto the prairie and collected wagon loads of bones and then hauled those to the railhead where they'd be shipped back to Chicago for processing into fertilizer. So that's how some of the first homesteaders made enough money to survive. They then had to go through a process of killing the sod, breaking the sod, tilling the ground. And again, these are people coming from Europe or further back east in the United States. This is a very different environment that they were then coming to, but all they knew how to do is what they knew how to do from where they were coming from. So it was in no way appropriate to where they were. But the short version is that in the course of this presentation, he says we can go back to the same places that we characterize soil types across the United States. And a lot of this work, the work's done largely. A lot of it was done in the 60s. In this example, he said we can go back to where we characterized this soil in the early 60s, the exact same place. We can go back and we can see that, okay, sorry, I use jargon and I have to explain the jargon. The very top layer of a soil is called the A horizon. That's where you have the highest amount of organic matter. And then below that is a B. And then a C horizon is the bit that's above the bedrock or the parent material. And so in this particular soil, he said that the top of the C horizon is now 19 inches closer to the soil surface than it was in the 60s when the soil was characterized. That represents a loss of organic matter. It represents a loss of soil, completely organic and inorganic material, through wind and water erosion. And anytime you till the soil, you make it more susceptible to erosion, as well as increase the oxidation of organic matter. So that means that these soils, they no longer have an A horizon. They now have an A-B horizon, which didn't used to exist. It's been mixed together now. And so this represents, I think what he said was, if they maintained current phosphate application rates and could achieve zero soil loss, it would take them about 100 years at current phosphate application rates to get back to where they were in the 1890s when they first started farming the soil. So when we're talking about sustainability, or when people are saying we need to be on a plant-based diet, that has implications that people frequently don't understand, let alone consider. The other one, and I know this is one that we talked about, we can, when you till a soil and introduce oxygen, and when you kill plants, there's no longer living roots in the soil. There are organic compounds that the plant roots exude into the soil that then increase the soil, the water stable structure of that soil. So I've seen these tests. You can find them on YouTube. If you look up the soil guy on YouTube, you can see some of
The
these
soil
tests.
guy. I bet he's got a lot of subscribers.
Yeah, exactly right. I know I'm geeky, but there you go. His name is Ray Archuleta. Used to work for USDA, and I think he's retired since. But this test, you can take, call them a clod. The technical term is PED, P-E-D. But they're an aggregate of soil. And this particular test that I have pictures of, I saw it in south central Nebraska. Same soil type. It's just that one has been under continuous conventional corn production. The other has been under grass for a long period of time. And so you take these clods from these two soils and you drop them into water columns where there's a wire basket to suspend them. They're completely submerged, but they're suspended in the water column. And in 25 minutes, the one from the cornfield has completely broken down. There was no water stable structure there. And so now that clod is either very fine particles at the bottom or even finer particles that are suspended in the water column. Meanwhile, the one from the grass stand is largely intact up in the water basket, and the water looks clear. There's a few smaller aggregates at the bottom, but you have water stable structure there. What that means is that soil, there will be a greater infiltration rate of water into that soil, so less runoff. More oxygen will be, the plant roots will get oxygen enough to support growth because it's not anaerobic in the soil. They need oxygen in order to function. So those soils will be more fertile, more productive, et cetera, et cetera. And so watershed health is enhanced by having well-managed grasslands in those systems compared to cropping systems. And it's not to say that we can't integrate. We can have rotations that go through grasslands and those sorts of things. Too often we talk about things as either or, but when we're being told that we need to shift to a more plant-based diet, I do like to point out that humanity's diet is already plant-based. The majority of humanity's calories and protein are coming from plants. And I think you and I and many in your audience would say, that's probably not a good thing. Let alone we shouldn't push it even further in that direction.
Right. I think we should get less calories from plants. But that's so interesting because I like that kind of ties things together with regard to soil quality. And I just want people to understand that having organic matter, having, as you mentioned earlier, perennial crops, grasses on soil is crucial for that soil to maintain proper health. And I'm not a soil scientist, so maybe I don't use all the right words, but the roots of those plants are going to keep the soil more stable. And as you say, as the plant shrinks and grows in size, it's going to return organic matter to that soil. And once we start tilling that soil, it really starts to degrade. And that the numbers that you suggest from that, I'm sure what is a riveting presentation about the phosphate in North Dakota. I'm sure everybody should go to the Soil Guys channel and check it out. It's actually a pretty interesting test to see these clod tests. But the idea that these seed horizons of the soil are moving closer to the surface, we're eroding the topsoil. This is a big deal because I think that cultures that preceded our westernized culture have always known that the health of a population was intimately connected with the health of the soil. And many believe that this is why previous civilizations died out. The Aztec, the Maya, they over-farmed the land and they couldn't grow anything on it anymore. If we deplete the topsoil in such a way that we deplete all of the phosphorus, we're in a big load of shit, for lack of a better, we're in a big problem there. And so it's interesting that, yeah.
Well, indeed, animals are a source of fertilizer. significant source of fertilizer around the world. So I think it's fair to say that we know more today than people used to know. The westward expansion of North American settlement, whatever word you want to use to describe it, was in fact driven by people basically depleting the soils, depleting the farmland. I mean, that's a long history. We can look at the southeastern U.S., and by the time of the Depression, we have massive erosion. We had massive problems that we've done something to limit, to avoid. However, there's still vast tracts of land that are not productive today because of the degree of erosion that took place in the 30s and prior. So, we have information available to us today to do a better job than we've done in the past. There's some aspects to all this. People have a romantic image of what the good old days used to be like. And I really want people to understand that they weren't all that good. There were significant problems that we today don't have to experience, certainly in this country. Now, the fact that, I just saw a presentation, 800 cases of rickets in the United Kingdom reported in 2015. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but given what we know, that's probably about 800 too many, right? And this was one of the presentations that was given at a seminar dealing with trying to increase the accessibility and use of animal source foods in Africa and Asia, and parts of the lesser developed world. But meanwhile, we have this lunacy, judgmental, in the Western world where, people are thinking that they can drink, almond juice and have that be an adequate substitute for real dairy products. And it's not just the calcium. It's not just the calcium and the vitamin D. You also need protein in order to make bones. And if you don't make that bone mass, and this is what I got from this presentation, if you don't make that bone mass in the teens and early 20s, then you're setting that human being up for osteoporosis in their 40s and 50s, because bone mass accumulation plateaus after the 20s and then, for a number of reasons, starts to decline. Well, if you've retarded that bone mass formation because of dietary choices or propagandistic messages about what you ought to be, consuming for your or the planet's health, and that limits your bone mass formation. You see what I'm saying? We're likely to see an increase in hip fractures in women in 10 or 20 years from now, because of what our children are being taught in public school and college. So there are times when this gets just really aggravating for me.
Yeah, I was just I did a podcast earlier this week that's going to be released probably just before this one with Paul Mason, who is a physician in Australia. And, I think that a lot of the clients that I see who are women are worried about osteoporosis, and the paradigm that osteoporosis is simply a calcium deficiency is vastly oversimplified. But the point that often gets left out that you highlight is that adequate protein in the diet is essential to making bone. We need minerals, we need calcium, we probably also need strontium and vanadium and manganese, and we also need adequate amounts of protein. And this is not a small amount of protein. And this is, as you sort of alluded to earlier, this is bioavailable protein. I strongly believe, and I suspect you would agree, that if we are only eating a plant-based diet, we are going to develop osteoporosis because of the relative utilization or the relative ability of the body to utilize plant versus animal protein. And we can talk about that a little bit too. But for people listening, if they're concerned about osteoporosis, my recommendations would be a robust amount of protein, and I'll clarify how much that is, from animal sources, because if people listen to the podcast I did on the minimalists, which will be out June 11th, it's probably going to be out before this podcast comes out. I had to correct Rich Roll on the fact that vegetable protein, plant-based protein, is really not that utilizable by humans. There are scores that Peter actually educated me about before that discussion with Rich Roll, specifically the digestible, indispensable amino acid score, which is pretty esoteric and we don't have to go into it. But these ideas, if you compare the amount of protein, the usable amount of nitrogen in animal versus plant sources, there's no comparison. Just like the nutrient bioavailability, there's no comparison. Animal protein, and correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, animal protein is probably twice as usable, twice as bioavailable as plant protein. And so if people are thinking about osteoporosis, I would recommend probably 0.7 grams of protein per pound of lean body weight. I think that's more than people usually get. But I think if people are getting that much protein, then we're going to really be able to make a dent in osteoporosis. And both Paul Mason and I agreed that osteoporosis and osteopenia are reversible if we get enough protein. So this idea of bioavailable protein is critical. And to think that, to think that there are people who are living on plant-based diets or children that are being raised on plant-based diets, I get worried about this. I get worried they're not having enough bioavailable protein to even make their bones, much less muscles. And then all the other nutrients that, we've talked about that aren't going to be there.
Yeah, absolutely. The short version is that it's inappropriate to talk about human diets and talk about protein intake on a percent of calories basis. And the simple version of that is your calories fluctuate, right? But your need for protein doesn't, not to that degree, right? So if you need 30 grams per meal of high quality, so 90 grams a day, whatever that number is, then that's 90 grams regardless of whether you're eating 3,000 calories or 2,000 or 4,000 calories a day, right? But that percentage would change dramatically. So that's not appropriate. Number two, on every label that you look at, when it says protein, it's a crude protein value. Now, back in the 1860s, proximate analysis, I think that's right, maybe it was 1880s, the proximate analysis testing system was developed, and just trying to quantify the nutritive value of feedstuffs, feed animals, food for humans. The way you determine crude protein is you determine the total nitrogen in any sample. And then you multiply that percent nitrogen by 6.25, and that then becomes your percent crude protein. Because we assume that all the nitrogen that we found in that feedstuff was in protein, and all that protein was 16% nitrogen. Well, that may well not be a good way to deal with monogastrics. It works for ruminants because ruminants can utilize non-protein nitrogen, just one of their specific and essential ecological functions. But monogastrics can't do that. So what that tends to do is make plant source, quote, protein, close quote, look a lot better than it ends up being. So a significant amount of the protein, in quotes, from plants ends up being non-amino acid nitrogen-containing materials. And then there are different scores that are used, and as you mentioned, DIAS is the one that they're going to try to use more and more because it actually avoids some of the problems that we've had with biological value or with protein, digestibility corrected, the PD-Cas, which was the last system. So I guess I just want people to understand the vast difference that exists between the functional disciplines of animal nutrition and then this thing that we call human nutrition. And it's hard for people to understand and appreciate that difference. Here's another example. If I take wheat straw and alfalfa hay, and I put both of those into a bomb calorimeter, I get very similar readings because that's gross energy. And it's very close to 4 kcals per gram, which should sound familiar. But there's vast differences in metabolizable energy that's available from those two plant sources. And ruminant nutrition, at least in the United States, goes even further down and begins to look at, well, what's the net energy available to support lactation from that feed, or maintenance or gain? And meanwhile, human nutrition is way back up at gross energy. It's interesting. So very different sort of, we've been completely sidetracked by this nutritional epidemiology of chronic disease stuff. And that's driven all the conversations that try to get us to believe that somehow animal source foods are a health hazard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I do not understand it, but that's what we're trying to correct.
Absolutely, absolutely. So again, if someone's really interested in improving the world, and I get it, that's a worthy sort of thing. There are two things. One is, focus on and give greater value to your own health and the health of your family. We have evidence that we cannot trust the experts to have with that role. I mean, we have to become educated consumers. We've not been well served by the experts for the last half century. So we need to learn about that. We need to, what's the figure? Only 12% of adult Americans today enjoy optimal metabolic health. 12, 1, 2. And so it's on us. It's what did Ken Berry say? It's not your fault, but it is your problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the good news is that when you improve your health, you are improving the world. And it may be the most concrete thing that you can do immediately. And to sort of give people that idea, because the reality is that you can either focus on increasing human flourishing worldwide, which I would argue would align with improving your own health, addressing metabolic illness, et cetera, or you can focus, your prime value can be on minimizing human impact. Now, by everything that I know, if we focus on improving human flourishing, we will get to minimizing impact. But the opposite is not true. If we solely focus on this idea of minimizing human impact, we won't get to the maximizing human flourishing. And so as we look worldwide and start saying, how are we going, we've got 2 billion more people coming at us, 2-3 billion, right? We're now at somewhere around 7. By 2050, we're looking at maybe another 2 by 2100, They're saying somewhere around 10 billion, depends on the figures. Interestingly enough, today it's estimated that out of that 7-some billion human beings, 2 billion of them are children. And in 2100, when we're looking at somewhere around 10 billion based on some estimates, we're still looking at 2 billion children, which is interesting. Then what that means is people are living longer. They're getting to be older adults. Well, we know they need more protein, and we know that they become less efficient at utilizing protein. So it needs to be of higher quality and greater amounts than you would need as an adult, right? So when somebody says there's too many people and we need to do something about it, it's like, what are you proposing here? Because we're still going to have the same number of children, right? They're just going to live longer. What are you proposing here? Right? I think it's a good thing that we live longer. I think that there's lots of narratives that if we really started teasing them apart, we'd find that they're probably in a space that we don't want to spend a lot of time in, pretty dark. So this, I think, has repercussions worldwide, not just in the United States or Western Europe. We tend to think of obesity and related disorders as the result of overconsumption or the result of not being active enough. And, the fact is it's a worldwide pandemic at this point. We can look at South Africa and see a rate of obesity that's similar to what we have in the United States. We can see the dramatic transition that's happened in a country like Brazil in 40 years. Today in the United States, or every day, I think the average statistic is 200 people have some part of their body cut off because of the standard of care for diabetes. But every 30 seconds, someone in the world loses a leg due to diabetes. So let's have a conversation about sustainability, informed by that kind of a worldview.
And I love what you said earlier. Well, you mentioned it about the hospitals, and I think that kind of ties into this now as well. This idea that healthcare is driving a significant amount of carbon emissions, and perhaps even more than animal-based agriculture. And the thing that you had said a few minutes ago really highlighted this for me, the idea that, and I would agree with you completely, to optimize human health, to optimize our health, the health of our families, should really be our first goal. And hopefully we've begun to illustrate in this discussion that doesn't necessarily have to be exclusive of being responsible for the planet, right? The idea that we can optimize human health, the health of our families, but that's going to take a toll on the planet no matter what we do, because as you mentioned in the beginning, we are heterotrophs. We have to eat something. And I think that the vegan narrative has been that if you're going to eat animals, you're going to kill the planet. And that's just silly. And that's kind of what we've been talking about a little bit, kind of woven throughout this discussion, that that's not necessarily the case. And I like that what you were suggesting was this idea that we should focus on being the healthiest humans that we can. We should focus on creating the healthiest families that we can, because if we are able to do that, then we are going to create robust populations of people who can come up with new formulas and will figure stuff out. And also, as we've talked about in this discussion, ruminant agriculture is critical toward returning nutrients to the soil and this ecosystems. And many of these figures around greenhouse gases are inflated and they're incorrect. And so I think focusing on human health is a great, great place to start. And as you're suggesting, the idea of sustainability has not been taken in the correct context in many of the discussions. We're just talking about the sustainability of an environment, when in fact we should be talking about the sustainability of healthy lives. And as you're pointing out, there's an incredible amount of preventable loss of human life and limb due to poor nutrition that's primarily based on plants. And that is completely correctable. And that is really if I understand you properly, that's where the discussion of sustainability should be, that we're talking about the sustainability of healthy human lives, sustainably productive, thriving humans, right?
Exactly so. There's a couple things. I mentioned at some point in our conversation, I mentioned this idea of stunting, of human development being suppressed due to a lack of essential nutrition, typically early. They talk about the first 1,000 days, but that extends in utero and then through infancy. But just some quotes. Stunting in the first 1,000 days condemns children to a lifetime of underachievement and underperformance. Stunting in the first 1,000 days is associated with nearly irreversible brain damage. And some animal source food consumption is needed for the growth and cognitive development in children and infants. So again, just like where heterotrophs is a fact, these things are facts. And so the problems that humanity is going to have to face and will be faced with, I have confidence that a larger group of well-nourished brains free to communicate with each other will find solutions. One last point on the comparison, the contribution of healthcare. A friend just put up something and linked to the document, and I haven't looked at it any further, but the global emissions of the pharmaceutical sector amount to more CO2 equivalents generated than by the automotive sector. Okay, so let's have a conversation about sustainability. That if we, when I first got into this space, and again, the personal thing for me, I started a dietary journey in 2007. 2010, I started showing up at conferences and then writing and speaking on this topic. Pretty soon I came across this definition of sustainability. And it's a really commonly used one. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I'll repeat things for a while, and then I make the mistake of thinking about it. And started thinking about this and going, well, wait a minute. How do we know what their needs are or will be? How good are we as a species at predicting the future? Do we have a really good track record of that? And the answer, of course, is no. And then I come across this really fun example, which is the great horse manure crisis of 1894. and the quote from the Times of London is in 1894, in 50 years, every street in London will be buried under 9 feet of manure. Right? The cities, back to the good old days, weren't all that good. When horses were the principal means of locomotion and power, cities were really nasty places. Right? I mean, there was all that manure and urine that was produced every single day. You had all kinds of accidents and problems. I mean, even to haul the manure away created manure, right? 25% of the cropland in the United States was dedicated for growing fuel for the tractors, right? So all of that, they had a major conference come together. They were going to come up with a solution. The best minds came together. They were going to spend as much time as it took. They planned on 10 days. They gave up after 3. They all agreed it was hopeless. None of them could imagine the internal combustion engine. We don't have a good history, and yet we do have an extensive history of somebody coming and predicting, dire catastrophes and impending crises, and they always sell well and they get people noticed, get them recognized, and then nothing, right? And understand that a big driver of our dietary goals and then guidelines was coming out of yet another of those movements of crises and catastrophe. If we don't do this, we won't be able to feed the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the people involved couldn't imagine any negative consequences. It's almost a quote of adopting this dietary approach. Well, you need a better imagination, I would suggest. So I have an aspirational goal for myself, and I would suggest it for everyone else. We should all strive against the generation and propagation of unnecessary human suffering and pain. Yes?
Yeah.
And then a quote from the World Health Organization: death is inevitable, but a life of protracted ill health is not. Chronic disease prevention and control helps people to live longer and healthier lives. But the World Health Organization doesn't yet understand, has not yet onboarded the message about metabolic health and species-appropriate nutrition.
And that could be...
Right, because there's the quote that Gary Taubes... There's the quote that Gary Taubes gives from the Director General of the World Health Organization that imagines diabetes as a worldwide epidemic that can't be avoided.
Which is just crazy. It's so avoidable, right? It's so avoidable. We know that. It just, yeah. I was talking, yeah.
It seems that way to me.
I was talking
with...
So
again, as we're, I understand the concern about... Please go ahead.
I was just talking with some residents here at the University of Washington the other day. I'm finishing up my residency, and, I was giving them a talk, and I said, is diabetes fixable? And they kind of looked at me like blank-eyed stares. And then I had to say, what's completely fixable, you guys? I mean, Of course, we had to clarify type 1 versus type 2. But yeah, I think that the epidemic of metabolic disease is quite preventable. And in my opinion, and I suspect yours, it has to do with getting adequate nutrition from animals and in many cases limiting our exposure to plants. So totally preventable stuff.
I do agree. That's what it seems like to me. Please.
Oh, I was just going to say that as we close here, I'd love to hear a little bit about your experience with eating animals, because I know that you've kind of experimented with a few diets, and I like to kind of bring it home to a personal level. Like, what do you do for your diet, and what have you seen? Have you seen your health improve with animal-based diets? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, so I mentioned earlier in 2007, I had my moment of clarity of realizing I was a 51-year-old balding, obese pre-diabetic. My wife, Nancy, had been on her own dietary journey for 5 years by that point. So if you can think back to 2002, the sort of resources that were available. And, we started with low carbohydrate. And again, it needs to be personal. So for a number of reasons, I think I'm just a lot more carbohydrate intolerant than Nancy is. Her mother is less than her, and her dad is less than her mom. So, it's learning to have the permission to adjust and monitor and find what works for you. But for me, somebody recently said, if you can't get it from animal source foods, you don't need it. And so I started with, Protein Power by Michael and Mary Dan Eads. That was the book that I mostly followed and experienced a significant amount of weight loss. Improved biomarkers. And then over time, I see the weight kind of creep back for a number of reasons: carb creep and loss of target lock and focus, and that sort of stuff. And then you kind of reach a new plateau higher than your low point, lower than your high point, not where you want to be. And then I just shifted to a much more animal source food based diet and immediately saw about 10 pounds come off that hadn't come off for a long time. And, feel better, digestive system feels better, not to be too graphic. So I'm not exclusively carnivorous at this point, but I'm largely so. So I like to try to counteract the narrative that says, it has to be organic and grass-fed. And I think Ken Barry talks about panda massaged. I talked about, watered with unicorn tears and harvested by the Vestal Virgins under the full moon, whatever the label claim is. That's all narrative stuff. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to find compelling evidence. Now, that's not to say we can't find quantitative differences, right? We have exquisite abilities to detect differences. What we lack is the ability to say the biological significance of those differences, especially in light of an entire diet or living situation. So when I hear Adele Height and Eric Westman talk about the patient that can go to the all-you-can-eat pizza buffet and scrape the toppings off the pizza and eat that and get better, right? When I hear Ted Naiman talk about the homeless patient who goes to the secondhand store, buys a cast iron skillet, goes to Safeway, buys the cheap 80-20 hamburger and the eggs, cheapest eggs available, eats that, cooks on a butane stove, pays $6 a day for food and fuel, and in a year dumps 70 pounds of excess body fat and, normalizes his blood markers. So he gets healthy doing that. Then again, I want to have a conversation about what's health food here. Why are, we have no justification for telling people they need to be spending more for. And so just trying to tell people, don't let that be a barrier to you adopting this lifestyle. Go to whatever store you have access to, buy the appropriate animal products for you and your experience, and whatever you can afford. And eat that, don't eat the other stuff. Rock on. Enjoy good health.
And I think in that situation, good health will probably come to those people. I love that anecdote from Ted Naiman. I hadn't heard that one. I think in that situation, good health will come to those people, seemingly miraculously, because they are returning to the way that we are built to eat as humans. And as we've talked about throughout this podcast, it's, that is where we find the nutrition that humans need. So that's really cool. Well, I hope that people, when they've been listening to this, have gotten a sense of your perspective. And, we don't have time to go into all of these environmental arguments. If people have more curiosity, I would encourage you to listen to Peter's talks from a number of conferences throughout the country that have happened in the last couple of years. Peter's spoken about many of these things and talked about water usage by ruminant animals, which is certainly much less than many vegans would lead you to believe. And again, that's another example of something where the figures have been distorted. But Peter goes into more detail about greenhouse gases. I think we got into that in good detail in this episode. But from an environmental perspective, I don't think there's any reason to avoid eating animals. And I hope that we've begun to make a compelling argument for people that eating ruminant animals is supporting ruminant agriculture, which is perhaps the best thing that we can do for long-term sustainability of the planet and the soil. So people should not worry about that. But I do fear that plant-based agendas will continue to try and undermine many of these concepts. So it's important to try and get real facts and data about the stuff out there. So Peter, thank you for being here. Thanks for having this discussion, my friend. I think we're fighting the good fight, and I think people are going to really benefit from this one.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. I certainly have a passion for this. Good luck to you in your transition to San Diego, and continue doing good work getting the news out to people.
I'm trying. Where can people find you if they want to learn more about the stuff that you're interested in, learn more about ruminant agriculture and the truth behind the environmental impact and probably good that it can do?
Sure. There's a couple things. Well, first of all, for myself, you can find me on Twitter and on Instagram, and there it's grass-based, one word. You can find me on Facebook by name, but I do have a page called Grass-Based Health. I also have a group that I call the Ruminati. So that you can find me by name on YouTube. And my email is peter.ballerstedt@gmail.com. As far as resources, I would direct people to their university extension services. So every state pretty much in the United States has an extension service, so you can start looking for online resources that describe agricultural practices. There's something called Meat Myth Crushers, which is put out by the American Meat Institute, and it addresses a number of topics that come up routinely about meat: hormone use, antibiotic residues, water use, welfare, all kinds of issues. And then the beefresearch.org, a lot of good sort of quantification work has been done looking at environmental footprints in different regions of the United States, as well as a lot of other research. And that's all funded through a voluntary checkoff from the beef industry. So beefresearch.org. So that would be a good place to start, but if anybody has any questions, they're certainly welcome to contact me.
Are you going to be at any conferences in the near future where people can hear you talk? What do you have coming up?
I have KetoCon coming up the end of this month, now that it's the first. So the end of June in Austin, Texas. Then the month after that, there's Keto Fest, as well as Low Carb San Diego. And then there's a bit of a hiatus. Low Carb Houston comes up in October. There's a couple others, some agricultural more than dietary, but those are usually accessible as well. And I'll try to make sure that those things are publicized.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll see you at KetoCon. I'm going to be there too, and I guess I'm moving to San Diego, so I'll have to check out Low Carb San Diego. I should get in touch with those guys and see. But I'll see you at KetoCon.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
Yeah, hopefully this should come out before then, so hopefully we'll see some folks at KetoCon. I would encourage you to talk to Peter about this stuff. If you have questions, go to his talk. I'm going to be talking about, surprise, surprise, the carnivore diet at KetoCon as well, so hopefully we'll meet some of you guys there. But Peter, thank you for being here. I appreciate all of your assistance. You were a huge part in my discussion with Rich Roll, and I think that he hopefully learned some from you via me by proxy. But I think we've been able to talk about a lot of cool stuff today, and I look forward to seeing you soon, my friend.
Thank you. I look forward to it as well. I'm glad I was able to pass on to you what others have shared with me. So glad to be of help in what you're doing. Thank you.
All right, guys, you know what to do. Stay radical. Yes, I thought that was awesome. Hope you guys learned a lot. I don't know how many people actually listen to the outro, but I like to talk, so they usually have some rambling at the end of the outro that's not always canned. But check out ancestralsupplements.com. Check out my newsletter, paulsaladinomd.com/newsletter, and check out Juve, www.juve.com/Paul. Check out Ancestral Supplements. I forgot to mention in the intro that my affiliate code is Paul Saladino MD. Actually, it's just Saladino MD. That'll get you 10% off, and you'll be stoked about it. All right, so do that. check out all those things. Please leave me a review if you like this. Let me know what I can do better. Send me an email directly, paulsaladinomd@gmail.com. You know I read them all because that's my email. So I will see you guys next week. I am in the process of moving to San Diego. Send me good vibes. I'm going to be surfing this week. Send me an email, paulsaladinomd@gmail.com if you are interested in working with me to work on your health issues or just to optimize. All right, you guys, have a great week. Talk to you soon.